It is my privilege to welcome Suzette von Broembsen, Principal and Partner at PSG Wealth, to our Women in Investing series. Today we're going to be digging a little bit deeper into the topic of offshore investments. The reasons for going offshore are well documented. Just type it into your browser and literally thousands of articles will pop up. The obvious one is that it's an opportunity to diversify from South Africa, which is an emerging market. But investing offshore also gives you access to currencies, countries, industries, which you can't access in South Africa. Now, Suzette, it can be a tricky minefield to navigate. So before we start, what is your recommendation to your clients on what percentage of their assets should go offshore?
Kwerty, thanks. It's lovely to chat to you again. The answer is very simple. Each family and each investor is completely different. So whilst we've got certain bands that we work with, we have found that South Africans tend to be underweight offshore. And this is not because of lack of care. This is simply because their homes are here, their income funds are here, their pension funds are here. So automatically their SA assets are larger than one should expect. BNP Paribas has done research, and they've, according to them, if you have 40% of all your assets, this includes your home, your pension fund, etc., overseas, then over the long term, which is 5 to 10 years, you should get a return of about inflation plus 6%. So generally, if I could give a benchmark, that's a figure to work with. What we also do is, with our clients during their retirement time, we actually don't bring those assets back, because the rand tends to weaken over time. You mentioned we're an emerging market, so that should still be the status for some time to come. And that weakening of the rand actually assists you to maintain your purchasing power when inflation goes up. So 40% is probably a fair figure to give to you.
Thanks, Suzette. That's helpful. Now, there are different ways of getting offshore exposure. One is through something called an asset swap, and the other one is using your offshore allowance to invest your capital directly into an offshore currency or product. Could you just briefly explain the difference to our viewers? Because I don't think everybody knows what an asset swap is.
Yeah, no problem. So an asset swap is when an investor like you or I use an asset management company like 91 or PSG's foreign allowance to buy their offshore exposure. This, in simple terms, mean you still get the diversification that you mentioned earlier, you still get the exposure to global markets, but your asset remains denominated in South Africa. Essentially what that means is when you have to repurchase your funds, you have to have those funds repatriated to South Africa or remitted to your SA bank account. So in simple terms, your money remains here. We tend to like having your funds in direct offshore portfolios. The main reason for that is you can then receive the proceeds of those portfolios to any bank account you have in the rest of the world. And how we do that is by applying for your foreign investment allowance, which each of us get 10 million rand per calendar year, or using your 1 million rand allowance, that is your discretionary allowance. You then basically transfer those funds offshore. You're purchasing an offshore portfolio in the currency of your choice, be it dollars, pounds, yen, euro, renminbi, and those monies remain offshore. I think something people tend to forget, or investors tend to forget, is that those assets don't disappear. It's not part of your estate. I've actually had it where clients think, oh nice, my money's in Switzerland, it's gone. It's not the case. So it is worthwhile to get financial advice and potentially structure it in a way where when you do repatriate or want to access those proceeds, it's tax efficient, even if it is paid outside of South Africa.
I think you've just answered my next question was, can I go it alone or do I actually need financial advice? I think you've answered it. It sounds like it can get quite complicated.
You can probably do what you wish, but you know, our viewpoint is there's such a big sphere of opportunities outside of South Africa. There are more than 200,000 listed unit trusts globally, and there are more than 60,000 stocks listed globally. So to try and navigate that minefield is hard. You know, I've done this for more than half my life, and every day there are new curveballs thrown at me. So to work with a wealth manager where there are proper research teams, there are proper substance to what they offer, there's some planning involved, could probably save you quite a lot over time. You know, the internet and Google is a great tool in hindsight, but it doesn't provide you with foresight. So if you had to invest some of your money today into global equity funds that had brilliant returns last year, I think you could be in for a very rough ride this year, because those funds or portfolios are definitely not going to do the same thing they did last year. So it's worthwhile to pay that 0.5% or that 1% to an advisor over time. What we've also found is that good advisors over years work with families for the long term. And then they start to understand an individual. They get an idea of what this person can take in terms of risk appetite. So your room for errors actually become much narrower, simply because there's a knowledge period and a history of decision making. And a relationship. So we would advocate using advisors with good research teams, but Google is out there, so definitely also an option. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another thing that might dissuade that first-time offshore investor is this notion that perhaps when, I've sent my money offshore, it's disappeared, I don't know how to access it, I can't access it. How easy is it relatively to access your investments offshore?
Quite luckily, the days of you receiving your envelope from London with your unit trust balance 3 months after the date of valuation is long over. So valuations are available 24 hours a day, at least in the liquid portfolios that PSG Wealth uses. And you can actually access your money within probably on simple terms between 2 and 5 working days, whether it be in South Africa or overseas. And if you use structured products or hedge funds, that term can be longer. It can be up to from 30 to 90 days before you can access your funds. And if you use wrappers like endowment products that 91 offers or other life and investment companies offers, it can be a term that you have to hold your funds for up to 5 years. But that discussion we have with a client when they are buying this offshore investment. Having an offshore wrapper, we absolutely love using it because its limitation, it's smart from a tax point of view, and from an estate planning point of view, it doesn't get wound up in your estate in South Africa. So the benefactors of that investment portfolio can access that capital probably within 1 or 2 months after the date of you or the owner of that investment vehicle passing. So in that case, 5 years should be in the back of one's mind, but there are other benefits to holding offshore wrappers when you transfer those funds into those vehicles.
So Suzette, we've established then that it makes sense to get financial advice because products and investments offshore can be complicated. And we've also established that you can keep track of where your money is invested at all times when it's offshore. So I'm going to move on to some real world scenarios. So scenario 1 is I live in South Africa, I have adult children living abroad. How do I get capital to them offshore tax efficiently, both whilst I'm alive and after my death?
That's a very good question.
Complicated?
Yes, very. And my answer is going to be broad, but hopefully it makes a difference to women out there. This is a scenario we sit with daily. We're parents, we're here, and our kids are studying overseas. So the money is here, the parents are here, but your kids are living in Australia or in New Zealand or in the US, which is the worst jurisdiction. And we tend to not take the simple assumption and just transfer cash, because that can bite the child or the parent later during their lifetime or death. So when you want to transfer funds to your child that's in a different jurisdiction, it's definitely worthwhile to get tax advice, even if it's a small amount. We've had a scenario 2 or 3 years ago where we took on a client. He went overseas, he had a family structure in Europe, and he innocently put $6,000 into that structure. And when he wanted to when this capital had to be transferred to the beneficiaries, we couldn't get it done. It took me 6 months of dealing with the Reserve Bank to clear the flow of these funds, the jurisdiction, and all this while, that capital sat in a money market fund. It couldn't do anything for the family. So when you are transferring funds abroad, whilst you are alive, speak to your advisor At PSG Wealth, we are fortunate to work with some of the best fiduciary experts in the country. So we've actually formed a relationship between ourselves and our clients over time. So we try to avoid these hurdles if and when we need to make payments. The second component, when you've passed, is even more critical and even more complicated, because the jurisdictions that your children are in change, and your will need to be drafted in such a way that when that child inherits those funds, he needs to inherit it in a tax-efficient way, and it's not simple.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Every jurisdiction has got different regulations, different estate duties. So we draft wills with the support of our tax and fiduciary experts, and we sometimes need to draft 2 wills, or even in certain cases 3 wills for clients, to make sure that these hard-earned assets that they've placed all over the world aren't decimated by taxes because they haven't taken those costs into account whilst they were alive. What have also happened is your kids move around, and then it's good to work with someone like an advisor where they know your child has left, they know in a different country. You redraft that will. You've got to adjust it. So it is an active process. But
ongoing active process.
Ongoing.
Yeah.
And it's worth it to pay people to support you on it. I think people have the perception that tax advisors are only for the ultra high net worth. That is long changed. It's not the case anymore. So definitely worthwhile to work when your kids are overseas, to work with the right team of people.
Thanks, Suzette. Okay, now scenario 2. If my husband has capital in South Africa, can he donate some of that capital to me and I then use my allowance to invest that offshore? Yes or no? And if yes, can I do it in my name or in his name? Or because I can imagine that gets a bit complicated too.
Yes. Firstly, if your husband donates some funds to you, he's very nice. So be thankful. But basically, in simple terms, in South Africa, we still got very beneficial donation rules between spouses. There's no tax for spouses to donate between each other, and the same goes for the wife. And if he donates those funds to you, you are able to transfer those funds offshore using your capacity. So it's important that he doesn't transfer into your offshore clearance account in your name, because it won't be accepted by SARB. Once he donates those funds to you, those funds are deemed to be yours. You transfer it offshore in your name, and that capital can be transferred to a bank account in your joint name offshore. But for South African Reserve Bank regulations, the actual investment portfolio overseas will now need to be your portfolio. So yes, as long as spouses are comfortable that once I donate those funds in essence is now my wife's funds or my husband's funds, and should there be a dispute, you can't take that donation back because it was a donation. So, but in essence, if all's going well, definitely a tool you can use.
Thank you, that's super helpful. Okay, my last scenario. If I or my family have a trust in South Africa, can we invest offshore via that trust? And can we inherit offshore assets in that trust?
It's definitely a worthwhile question, as a lot of South Africans use trust entities for intergenerational planning. And I mean, our discussion is about women, and many women actually contributed the biggest part to that trust asset. So it's important that they understand the consequences. If you have assets in your trust in South Africa, you can invest it offshore, but it has to be via an asset swap investment.
So it's repatriated into rands.
Yes, you get your statement in rands, it's in South Africa, when you repurchase it pays here. If you've got assets overseas, you can inherit those assets in a trust in South Africa. That will be a drafting part, a component of your will, but, and it's a big but, that's going to mean those assets have to come back.
So back into rands.
Back into rands. So you'd essentially selling your offshore portfolio, repatriating it back into South Africa to receive those funds in your trust in South Africa. A trust can apply to hold offshore assets in its state for a family with the Reserve Bank, but it's a tricky application. So in simple terms, if you want to inherit funds into your trust, it's going to have to come back to South Africa. The second component, which is a completely different discussion, which we can maybe one day have, is if you have got funds in dollar portfolios and you want to retain it in a trust nature, then you look at something completely different, which is, do I set up an offshore structure for my family? Do I have an offshore trust that can inherit those funds during my life or after my death? And that's a completely different discussion from a planning point of view, as it is expensive. There are limitations. Jurisdictions matter. So that would probably be a discussion we can have at a different time.
I think the lessons I've taken is that it can be very complicated. It's good to have an advisor, and I'm going to start small. So I'm going to end on a personal question, if I may, Suzette. What percentage of your assets is invested offshore?
So my husband and I both own businesses in South Africa. So when we've got spare funds, we decide where do we want to allocate it. We take those values of our businesses into account. If you look at just our liquid portfolio and you exclude our businesses and our lifestyle assets, 70% of our liquid portfolio is actually invested offshore, and 30% of our liquid investable assets, unit trust, stocks, money markets, are invested in South Africa. Mainly because we think South Africa is actually offering quite good opportunities for investors at this point. So we like having that 30%. However, once you've taken, and every investor should do this, once you've taken your business assets and your lifestyle assets into account, our number shifts completely because that's all settled here. So that shifts our offshore exposure to only 30% and our local exposure to 70%. So in our planning at the moment, we're still slowly but surely externalizing cash to get to that 40-50% margin that we'd be comfortable with. Something else, and I mean, these discussions are for women, is our children are most likely going to study overseas, going to live overseas. So by having some of those funds offshore, we're buying ourselves purchasing power for one day, paying for university fees, or simply just to go and visit them. It doesn't mean we want to leave South Africa. It just provides us with a financial capability to pay for dollar expenses when our family is older. And I mean, at the end of the day, family is what you look at when you are managing your investment portfolio. It's for nothing else.
Thanks, Suzette. Lots of food for thought. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to welcoming you again. Thank you.
Thanks, Gertie.